Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The autumn of 1962 brought with it an unseasonable chill to the remote valleys of the Austrian Alps, where Dr. Heinrich Kellner had arrived to catalogue the remnants of the Montclair estate. What began as a routine archival expedition for the University of Vienna would soon evolve into something far more disturbing than any academic pursuit warranted. The Montclair castle had stood abandoned for nearly 2 centuries, its Gothic spires piercing the perpetual mist that clung to the mountainside like a burial shroud. Local villagers spoke of the place in hushed tones, crossing themselves when forced to acknowledge its existence. They called it Verfluchtes Schloss, the cursed castle, though none could articulate precisely why the name had endured through generations of whispered warnings. Dr. Kellner's initial interest in the estate stemmed from a peculiar entry he had discovered in the Habsburg genealogical records. A single line, written in faded ink, referenced Princess Dorothea Montclair as the final branch of a withered tree. The notation was accompanied by a date, 1789, and nothing more. No birth record, no death certificate, no marriage documentation. For a genealogist of Kellner's reputation, such an omission represented an irresistible mystery. The journey to the castle required a treacherous ascent along paths that seemed to have been deliberately obscured by time and neglect. Ancient stone markers, worn smooth by centuries of alpine weather, bore inscriptions in a dialect that predated modern German. The local guide, a weathered man named Klaus Brenner, had agreed to accompany Kellner only after receiving payment that exceeded his annual income. Even then, Brenner insisted they complete their business before nightfall, citing reasons he refused to elaborate upon. As they approached the castle's outer walls, Kellner noted the peculiar architecture that seemed to defy conventional medieval design. The structure appeared to have been built in concentric circles, with each successive ring rising higher than the last, creating a spiral effect that drew the eye inexorably toward the central tower. The stonework displayed an unsettling quality, too smooth, too uniform, as if the builders had possessed knowledge of construction techniques that would not be discovered for centuries to come. The main entrance stood partially collapsed, its massive oak doors hanging askew on corroded hinges. Beyond the threshold lay a courtyard overgrown with vegetation that seemed wrong for the climate. Pale, twisted vines crept along the walls, bearing no leaves despite the season, while patches of earth remained barren in perfect geometric patterns. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of wind moving through unseen passages within the castle's depths. Kellner's first significant discovery came within the castle's library, a circular chamber located in the eastern wing. Unlike the rest of the structure, this room had been preserved with remarkable care. Leather-bound volumes lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their spines bearing titles in Latin, German, and languages Kellner could not identify. The air carried the scent of parchment and something else, something organic and faintly sweet that seemed to emanate from the books themselves. At the center of the library stood an ornate reading desk, upon which lay an open manuscript written in an elegant hand. The pages appeared to be a genealogical chart, but one unlike any Kellner had encountered in his decades of research. The family tree depicted on the parchment showed a pattern of marriages that defied conventional understanding of noble bloodlines. Brothers wed sisters, cousins married cousins, and in some cases, the connections suggested relationships that challenged the very foundations of genetic possibility. The name Dorothea appeared repeatedly throughout the chart, not as a single individual, but as a recurring designation that seemed to pass from generation to generation. Each entry was accompanied by detailed physical descriptions that grew increasingly disturbing as the bloodline progressed. Early generations were described in conventional terms: height, hair color, distinguishing features. Later entries included notations that seemed more appropriate for medical case studies than genealogical records. As daylight began to fade, casting long shadows across the library floor, Kellner made a discovery that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Hidden beneath the genealogical chart was a second document, this one bearing the seal of the Habsburg court physician. The paper was a medical report dated 1789, describing the birth of Princess Dorothea Montclair in clinical terms that grew more unsettling with each line. The report detailed physical abnormalities that suggested generations of genetic isolation had reached their inevitable conclusion. Yet the document's most disturbing aspect was not its medical observations, but rather its final notation. The child exhibits signs of awareness beyond her years, as if ancient knowledge flows through blood too pure for this world. Brenner's urgent calls from the courtyard interrupted Kellner's examination of the documents. The guide's voice carried a note of panic that penetrated the library's oppressive silence, reminding the scholar that darkness was approaching, and with it, whatever forces had earned this place its cursed reputation. The following morning brought no relief from the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to permeate every stone of the Montclair estate. Dr. Kellner had spent a restless night in the village inn, his sleep plagued by dreams of twisted family trees and corridors that led nowhere. Despite Brenner's obvious reluctance, the guide agreed to return to the castle, though he insisted on carrying a collection of religious artifacts that his grandmother had pressed upon him before their departure. Kellner's second day of exploration led him to the castle's medical wing, a series of chambers that had once served as the private quarters of the court physician. The rooms were connected by a narrow corridor lined with portraits whose subjects bore an unmistakable family resemblance. Each painting depicted members of the Montclair lineage, and as Kellner progressed deeper into the wing, the faces in the portraits began to display subtle but disturbing similarities that suggested a bloodline grown dangerously insular. The physician's study contained an extensive collection of medical instruments, many of which appeared to be custom-made for purposes that conventional medicine could not explain. Glass cabinets displayed an array of measuring devices designed to catalogue physical abnormalities with scientific precision. Calipers of unusual design, charts depicting cranial measurements, and detailed anatomical drawings suggested a level of medical observation that bordered on obsession. Within the physician's desk, Kellner discovered a leather-bound journal that chronicled nearly a century of medical observations regarding the Montclair family. The entries began in 1698 with routine notations about common ailments and treatments. However, as the decades progressed, the physician's writing revealed a growing concern about the genetic consequences of the family's marriage practices. Dr. Johann Weiss, the court physician whose name appeared on countless documents throughout the castle, had maintained meticulous records of each generation's physical and mental characteristics. His early entries displayed the detached professionalism expected of a man of science. But later, passages revealed an increasing unease with what he was documenting. The physician wrote of children born with extraordinary intelligence, coupled with physical frailties that defied medical understanding. The journal's most disturbing entries concerned the final generation of the Montclair line. Dr. Weiss described Princess Dorothea's birth in clinical terms that grew increasingly troubled as the infant developed. The child displayed cognitive abilities that surpassed those of adults, yet her physical form bore the unmistakable marks of genetic deterioration. The physician noted that the princess seemed to possess knowledge of events that had occurred before her birth, speaking of deceased relatives with intimate familiarity, despite never having met them. Kellner found himself particularly disturbed by Dr. Weiss's observations regarding the princess's eyes. The physician wrote extensively about their unusual coloration, a pale violet that seemed to shift in different lighting conditions. More unsettling were the doctor's notes about the child's gaze, which he described as possessing an ancient quality that suggested awareness of things beyond her years or station. The medical records revealed that Princess Dorothea's parents, Count Friedrich and Countess Elisabeth Montclair, were themselves the products of generations of carefully orchestrated unions designed to preserve the family's bloodline. The genetic isolation had reached such extremes that the princess represented the convergence of multiple ancestral lines, creating a concentration of hereditary traits that nature had never intended. Dr. Weiss's journal entries from 1789 described increasingly strange phenomena surrounding the young princess. Servants reported that animals refused to enter her presence, and plants withered in rooms where she spent extended periods. The physician initially dismissed these accounts as superstition, but his own observations began to support the servants' claims. He documented instances where the princess demonstrated knowledge of languages she had never been taught, and displayed familiarity with historical events that predated her birth by centuries. The final entries in Dr. Weiss's journal revealed a man struggling to reconcile his scientific training with observations that challenged rational explanation. He wrote of consulting ancient texts in the castle's library, seeking precedents for the phenomena he was witnessing. The physician's handwriting became increasingly erratic as he described his growing conviction that the Montclair bloodline had achieved something that transcended normal human genetics. In his last recorded entry, dated December 1789, Dr. Weiss wrote of his decision to leave the castle permanently. He described Princess Dorothea as having reached a state of development that he could no longer classify as entirely human. The child's intelligence had grown to encompass knowledge that seemed to flow from the collective memory of her ancestors, as if the genetic concentration had created a vessel for accumulated consciousness. The physician's final words in the journal carried a warning that would echo through the centuries. What we have created in our pursuit of purity is not the preservation of noble blood, but the concentration of something that should have remained dispersed. The princess carries within her the weight of all who came before, and I fear what such a burden might produce. As Kellner closed the journal, he noticed that his hands had begun to tremble. The afternoon light filtering through the medical wing's windows seemed dimmer than it should have been, and somewhere in the castle's depths he could hear the faint sound of footsteps that had no earthly source. The third day of Dr. Kellner's investigation brought him to the castle's upper levels, where the nursery chambers had been sealed for nearly 2 centuries. The heavy wooden doors bore multiple layers of wax seals, each impressed with the Montclair family crest and dated in succession from 1789 through 1791. The seals suggested that the rooms had been closed not once, but repeatedly, as if successive generations had felt compelled to ensure that whatever lay within remained undisturbed. Breaking the final seal required considerable effort, and as the door swung open, a rush of stale air carried with it the scent of lavender and something else. Something that reminded Kellner uncomfortably of old bones left too long in sunlight. The nursery itself defied the abandonment that characterized the rest of the castle. Unlike other chambers, where dust and decay had claimed dominion, this room appeared to have been preserved by some unseen force. The nursery's centerpiece was an elaborate cradle carved from a single piece of black oak. The craftsmanship displayed a level of artistry that bordered on the supernatural, with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow when viewed peripherally. Surrounding the cradle were toys and furnishings that spoke of extraordinary wealth and care. Yet each item bore subtle wrongness that became more apparent upon closer examination. A collection of dolls arranged along the windowsill drew Kellner's immediate attention. Each figure had been crafted to represent a member of the Montclair lineage, their faces bearing the distinctive features that marked the family's genetic heritage. The dolls were arranged in chronological order, and as Kellner studied them, He noticed that each successive generation displayed more pronounced physical abnormalities. The final doll in the series, presumably representing Princess Dorothea, possessed features so delicate and ethereal that they seemed almost translucent. The nursery's walls were adorned with educational materials that revealed the extraordinary nature of the princess's upbringing. Charts depicting astronomical phenomena, mathematical equations that predated their supposed discovery by decades, and linguistic guides for languages that scholars believed had been extinct for centuries, suggested that the child's education had encompassed knowledge far beyond conventional noble instruction. Within an ornate writing desk, Kellner discovered a collection of papers that appeared to be the princess's own work. The handwriting displayed a maturity that seemed impossible for a child, yet the dates on the documents confirmed they had been created during Princess Dorothea's infancy. The papers contained observations about the nature of heredity that would not be formally recognized by science for another century, written in a hand that grew more sophisticated with each passing month. Most disturbing among the princess's writings were her genealogical studies, which demonstrated an intimate knowledge of her family's history that extended far beyond what any child could have learned through conventional means. She wrote of ancestors as if she had known them personally, describing their thoughts, fears, and secret desires with unsettling accuracy. The papers suggested that Princess Dorothea had somehow inherited not just the physical traits of her lineage, but their memories as well. A leather-bound diary, hidden beneath the desk's false bottom, contained the princess's most personal reflections. The entries revealed a child struggling with the weight of inherited consciousness, describing dreams where she experienced the lives of her predecessors as if they were her own memories. She wrote of feeling crowded within her own mind, as if multiple personalities competed for dominance within her developing psyche. The diary's most chilling passages described the princess's growing awareness of her unique nature. She wrote of conversations with ancestors who appeared to her in moments of solitude, offering guidance and sharing knowledge that spanned centuries. These encounters were not described as supernatural visitations, but as natural consequences of her concentrated bloodline, as if genetic purity had created a conduit between past and present. Princess Dorothea's final diary entries, dated in late 1789, revealed a child who had begun to understand the true nature of her existence. She wrote of feeling like a vessel created to contain the accumulated essence of her family line, describing herself as both individual and collective consciousness. The princess expressed a growing sense of responsibility for preserving not just her bloodline, but the knowledge and experiences of all who had come before her. The nursery's most unsettling feature was discovered behind a tapestry depicting the Montclair family tree. A hidden alcove contained a collection of mirrors arranged in a precise geometric pattern. Each mirror reflected not the viewer's image, but scenes from the castle's past, as if the glass had somehow captured and preserved moments from previous centuries. In one mirror, Kellner glimpsed a figure that could only be Princess Dorothea, standing in the very nursery where he now stood, her violet eyes seeming to look directly at him across the centuries. As evening approached, Kellner found himself reluctant to leave the nursery, despite the growing sense of unease that permeated the chamber. The room seemed to exist outside normal time, and he began to understand why successive generations had felt compelled to seal it away from the world. The fourth day of exploration led Dr. Kellner to the castle's portrait gallery, a vast hall that stretched the entire length of the western wing. Unlike the other chambers he had investigated, this room showed signs of recent maintenance, as if someone had been caring for it long after the castle's supposed abandonment. The portraits themselves seemed to watch his progress with eyes that followed his movement, their gazes creating an oppressive sense of scrutiny that made his skin crawl. The gallery contained over 200 paintings spanning 4 centuries of Montclair history, Each portrait bore a brass nameplate indicating the subject's name, birth year, and relationship to the family line. What struck Kellner immediately was the mathematical precision with which the marriages had been arranged. The family tree revealed a pattern of unions so carefully orchestrated that they resembled a scientific experiment rather than natural romantic attachments. The earliest portraits depicted robust individuals with strong features and healthy complexions. Count Wilhelm Montclair, painted in 1543, possessed the bearing of a military commander, his broad shoulders and steady gaze suggesting physical and mental vigor. His wife, Countess Margaret, displayed the refined beauty typical of Renaissance nobility, her intelligent eyes hinting at the education that would become a hallmark of Montclair women. As Kellner progressed through the centuries, the portraits revealed the gradual transformation of the bloodline. Each successive generation displayed more refined features, as if the family's genetic isolation was distilling their appearance toward some idealized form. The men grew more delicate, their military bearing replaced by scholarly contemplation. The women became increasingly ethereal, their beauty taking on an otherworldly quality that seemed to transcend mere physical attractiveness. The portraits from the 17th century marked a turning point in the family's appearance. Count Friedrich III, painted in 1687, possessed features so refined they bordered on the feminine. His pale complexion and violet-tinged eyes suggested a bloodline that had moved beyond conventional human genetics. The accompanying portrait of his wife, Countess Elisabeth, revealed a woman whose beauty had achieved an almost supernatural perfection, her translucent skin seeming to glow within a light. Kellner discovered that many of the later portraits contained hidden details that became apparent only under specific lighting conditions. When afternoon sunlight struck the paintings at particular angles, additional figures appeared in the backgrounds, ghostly forms that seemed to represent the accumulated presence of previous generations. These spectral additions suggested that the Montclair artists had been documenting more than mere physical appearance. The penultimate portrait in the series depicted Count Friedrich IV and Countess Elisabeth II, Princess Dorothea's parents. The painting revealed individuals who had achieved a level of genetic refinement that challenged the boundaries of human variation. Their features displayed perfect symmetry. Their skin possessed an alabaster quality that seemed almost translucent, and their eyes held depths that suggested consciousness expanded beyond normal human limitations. The final portrait in the gallery stood apart from the others, both in its placement and its unsettling properties. Princess Dorothea's likeness had been painted when she was approximately 6 months old, yet the artist had captured something in her expression that suggested awareness far beyond her chronological age. Her violet eyes seemed to contain centuries of accumulated knowledge, and her delicate features hinted at genetic perfection achieved through generations of careful breeding. What disturbed Kellner most about the princess's portrait was its apparent ability to change depending on the viewer's perspective. From certain angles, she appeared as an innocent child, her expression reflecting the natural curiosity of infancy. From others, her face seemed to hold the wisdom and weariness of someone who had lived for centuries. The painting's eyes followed observers with an intensity that suggested conscious awareness, as if the princess's essence had somehow been captured and preserved within the canvas. Beneath Princess Dorothea's portrait, Kellner discovered a hidden compartment containing the artist's notes. The painter, a master craftsman named Heinrich Stolz, had documented his growing unease during the commission. Stolz wrote of the infant's disturbing habit of remaining perfectly still during sessions, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made his hands shake. The artist described feeling as though he was being studied rather than creating a study, as if the child was somehow painting him through her observation. Stoltz's final notes revealed his conviction that he had captured something beyond mere physical likeness. He wrote of dreams where the completed portrait spoke to him, sharing knowledge of events that had not yet occurred. The artist's handwriting became increasingly erratic as he described his growing belief that the painting had become a vessel for the princess's consciousness, a window through which her accumulated ancestral awareness could observe the world. As darkness fell over the castle, Kellner found himself unable to leave the gallery. The portrait seemed to pulse with life in the flickering candlelight, and he began to understand that he was not merely studying the Montclair family history, but becoming part of it through his very presence in their ancestral home. Dr. Kellner's fifth day within the Montclair estate brought him to a discovery that would fundamentally alter his understanding of the family's obsession with genetic purity. Hidden beneath the castle's foundation, accessible only through a concealed passage behind the library's eastern wall, lay a laboratory that defied the technological limitations of the 18th century. The chamber appeared to have been carved directly from the mountain's bedrock, its walls lined with instruments and charts that suggested scientific pursuits far beyond conventional noble interests. The laboratory's centerpiece was an enormous genealogical chart that covered an entire wall, its intricate details mapping not just family relationships but genetic probabilities calculated with mathematical precision that would not be formally recognized for another century. The chart revealed that the Montclair family's marriage practices were not merely traditional noble arrangements, but carefully orchestrated experiments designed to concentrate specific hereditary traits across successive generations. Along the laboratory's perimeter stood glass cases containing preserved specimens that documented the physical evolution of the Montclair bloodline. Hair samples from each generation showed a gradual shift from conventional brown and blonde tones to the distinctive silver white that characterized the family's later members. Dental impressions revealed increasingly refined jaw structures, while cranial measurements demonstrated a consistent expansion of brain capacity that seemed to accelerate with each successive generation. Dr. Kellner discovered detailed breeding records that treated the Montclair lineage with the same scientific rigor typically applied to livestock improvement. The documents revealed that marriages had been arranged not for political advantage or romantic attachment, but to maximize the concentration of specific genetic markers that the family had identified as desirable. Each union was preceded by extensive analysis of both partners' hereditary characteristics, with detailed predictions about their offspring's likely traits. The laboratory contained instruments designed to measure qualities that conventional science could not quantify. Devices with no apparent modern equivalent seemed intended to assess what the records termed ancestral resonance, the degree to which individuals could access inherited memories and knowledge. Charts documented the increasing strength of this phenomenon across generations, suggesting that the Montclair family had been deliberately breeding for enhanced genetic memory. Within a locked cabinet, Kellner found vials containing blood samples from multiple generations of the family. Each sample was labeled with detailed notes about its donor's capabilities and characteristics. The blood from earlier generations appeared normal, but samples from later family members displayed unusual properties. Some seemed to shimmer with an inner light, while others remained warm to the touch despite having been stored for decades. The laboratory's most disturbing feature was a collection of journals documenting experimental procedures conducted on family members themselves. The records revealed that each generation had willingly participated in studies designed to enhance their hereditary gifts. Children were subjected to treatments intended to strengthen their connection to ancestral memories, while adults underwent procedures aimed at preserving their consciousness for future generations. Princess Dorothea's file contained the most extensive documentation, revealing that her development had been monitored from conception through infancy with obsessive attention to detail. The records showed that her parents had undergone genetic preparation for months before her conception, following protocols designed to maximize the concentration of their combined bloodlines. The princess herself had been subjected to treatments that seemed designed to accelerate her access to inherited knowledge. The laboratory's final section contained what appeared to be preservation equipment intended to maintain genetic material indefinitely. Glass chambers filled with unknown fluids held samples that the records claimed could remain viable for centuries. The documentation suggested that the Montclair family had been preparing for the possibility that their bloodline might need to be reconstituted at some future date, when the accumulated genetic damage from inbreeding could be reversed through advanced scientific techniques. Dr. Kellner's examination of the laboratory's records revealed the true scope of the Montclair family's ambitions. They had not merely been preserving noble bloodlines, but attempting to create a form of genetic immortality that would allow their consciousness to persist across generations. Princess Dorothea represented the culmination of this effort, a vessel containing the accumulated knowledge and awareness of her entire lineage. The laboratory's final logbook entry, dated December 1789, described Princess Dorothea's transformation into something beyond conventional human classification. The records indicated that she had achieved complete access to her ancestral memories, effectively becoming a living repository of centuries of accumulated consciousness. The entry concluded with preparations for the princess's preservation, suggesting that the family had developed methods to maintain her existence indefinitely. As Kellner absorbed the implications of his discoveries, he began to understand that the Montclair castle was not merely an abandoned noble residence, but a carefully designed facility for genetic experimentation that had achieved results far beyond anything conventional science could explain. The sixth day of Dr. Kellner's investigation led him deeper into the castle's subterranean levels, following a series of stone steps that descended far below the laboratory he had discovered the previous day. The air grew progressively colder as he descended, carrying with it a peculiar sweetness that reminded him of flowers left too long in standing water. Emergency lighting of unknown origin illuminated the passage, suggesting that some form of maintenance had continued long after the castle's supposed abandonment. At the bottom of the staircase, Kellner encountered a massive circular chamber that appeared to have been carved from a single piece of granite. The walls were lined with alcoves, each containing what appeared to be preservation apparatus of extraordinary sophistication. Glass cylinders filled with luminescent fluid created an ethereal glow that bathed the chamber in shifting patterns of blue and silver light. The technology displayed a level of advancement that seemed impossible for the 18th century, yet the construction bore unmistakable signs of age that confirmed its historical authenticity. The chamber's central feature was an elaborate preservation system that dwarfed the smaller units arranged around the perimeter. The apparatus consisted of multiple interconnected cylinders, each filled with fluid that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. Monitoring equipment of unknown design displayed readings that fluctuated in patterns too complex for Kellner to decipher, yet the overall impression suggested a system maintaining something in a state of suspended animation. Documentation found within sealed cabinets revealed that the chamber had been designed specifically for Princess Dorothea's preservation. The records indicated that her unique genetic composition required specialized conditions that conventional preservation methods could not provide. The princess's concentrated bloodline had created physiological requirements that necessitated the development of entirely new preservation technologies, combining alchemical knowledge with scientific principles that would not be formally recognized for centuries. The preservation protocols detailed in the chamber's logbooks revealed the extraordinary measures taken to maintain Princess Dorothea's existence. Her body required constant exposure to specific mineral compounds extracted from the mountain's bedrock, while her consciousness needed to be sustained through electromagnetic fields that kept her ancestral memories accessible. The system had been designed to maintain her in a state between life and death, preserving both her physical form and her accumulated genetic knowledge. Kellner discovered that the preservation process had been initiated in December 1789, when Princess Dorothea's physical form had begun to deteriorate under the weight of her concentrated genetics. The records described her transformation into something that transcended normal human classification, requiring intervention to prevent the loss of centuries of accumulated consciousness. The preservation chamber represented the family's final attempt to maintain their genetic legacy beyond the limitations of conventional mortality. The chamber's monitoring systems revealed that the preservation process remained active, with readings indicating stable maintenance of whatever lay within the central apparatus. Temperature controls maintained precise environmental conditions, while filtration systems ensured the purity of the preservation fluids. The technology operated with a reliability that suggested either supernatural intervention or scientific knowledge far beyond the capabilities of the 18th century. Within the chamber's archives, Kellner found detailed plans for the eventual restoration of Princess Dorothea's consciousness to active awareness. The documents described procedures for gradually awakening her from preservation, allowing her accumulated knowledge to be accessed by future generations. The plans suggested that the Montclair family had viewed the princess not as an individual, but as a repository of genetic memory that could be consulted when needed. The preservation chamber's final section contained equipment designed to extract and transfer genetic material from the preserved subject. The apparatus suggested that Princess Dorothea's bloodline could be continued even in her suspended state, allowing future generations to benefit from her concentrated genetics. The technology implied possibilities that challenged conventional understanding of reproduction and genetic inheritance. As Kellner studied the chamber's systems, he began to realize that Princess Dorothea's preservation represented more than mere scientific achievement. The apparatus suggested that the Montclair family had successfully created a form of genetic immortality, maintaining their accumulated consciousness in a state that could persist indefinitely. The princess had become not just the culmination of their bloodline, but its eternal guardian, preserving centuries of knowledge for future access. The chamber's oppressive atmosphere and the constant hum of preservation equipment created an environment that seemed to exist outside normal time, where the boundaries between life and death had been deliberately blurred through scientific manipulation that defied rational explanation. Dr. Kellner's seventh day within the Montclair estate began with a discovery that would forever alter his understanding of the preservation chamber's true purpose. Hidden within a concealed panel behind the monitoring equipment, he found a series of activation protocols that had been designed to restore Princess Dorothea to conscious awareness. The documents revealed that her preservation was not intended as permanent suspension, but as a temporary measure until conditions became favorable for her return to active existence. The activation procedures detailed a complex sequence of environmental adjustments that would gradually restore the princess's consciousness while maintaining the integrity of her accumulated genetic memories. The process required precise timing and coordination of multiple systems, suggesting that her awakening had been planned as a carefully orchestrated event rather than a spontaneous occurrence. Temperature modifications, Fluid composition changes and electromagnetic field adjustments were all calibrated to specific measurements that had been calculated with mathematical precision. Kellner discovered that the activation protocols included provisions for mental preparation of whoever would serve as the princess's initial contact upon awakening. The documents described the psychological impact of encountering someone who possessed centuries of inherited consciousness, warning that unprepared individuals might suffer permanent mental trauma from exposure to such concentrated awareness. Detailed instructions outlined meditation techniques and mental exercises designed to strengthen the mind against the overwhelming presence of accumulated genetic memory. The chamber's monitoring systems revealed subtle changes that suggested the preservation apparatus was responding to Kellner's presence. Readings that had remained stable for nearly 2 centuries began to fluctuate in patterns that seemed to correlate with his movements throughout the chamber. The princess's vital signs, displayed on instruments of impossible sophistication, showed increased activity that indicated growing awareness of external stimuli. Within the activation protocols, Kellner found references to a phenomenon the documents termed genetic resonance, the ability of individuals with compatible bloodlines to communicate with the preserved consciousness without formal awakening procedures. The records suggested that Princess Dorothea's awareness remained partially active even during preservation, allowing her to sense and interact with visitors who possessed the necessary genetic markers for such communication. The chamber's atmospheric conditions began to shift as Kellner continued his investigation, with temperature fluctuations and pressure changes that seemed to follow no mechanical pattern. The preservation fluids within the central apparatus displayed increased luminescence, while monitoring equipment registered energy readings that exceeded the system's normal operational parameters. The changes suggested that the princess's consciousness was responding to his presence with growing intensity. Kellner's examination of the activation equipment revealed that the awakening process could be initiated through a series of manual controls located throughout the chamber. The system had been designed to prevent accidental activation while allowing authorized individuals to restore the princess to consciousness when circumstances warranted her return. Detailed biometric scanners suggested that only individuals with specific genetic markers could access the activation protocols. The documentation revealed that Princess Dorothea's preservation included provisions for knowledge transfer that would allow her accumulated consciousness to be shared with compatible recipients. The process involved direct neural interface through equipment that seemed to combine 18th century craftsmanship with technology that defied historical explanation. Recipients of such transfers would gain access to centuries of inherited memories while risking psychological integration with the princess's overwhelming awareness. As the chamber's systems continued to respond to Kellner's presence, he began to experience sensations that suggested direct contact with the preserved consciousness. Fragmentary images flashed through his mind, glimpses of castle life from previous centuries, faces of long-dead Montclair family members, and knowledge of events that had occurred before his birth. The experiences felt like memories that belonged to someone else, yet they carried the emotional weight of personal recollection. The activation protocol's final section contained warnings about the consequences of premature awakening. The documents describe Princess Dorothea's consciousness as having evolved beyond normal human limitations during her preservation, developing capabilities that might prove dangerous to unprepared individuals. Her accumulated genetic memories had apparently achieved a level of integration that created awareness spanning multiple centuries, making her consciousness incompatible with conventional human interaction. As evening approached, Kellner found himself facing a decision that would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the future of human understanding regarding genetic inheritance and consciousness preservation. The activation controls remained within reach, while the chamber's systems continued to respond to his presence with increasing intensity, suggesting that Princess Dorothea's awareness was growing stronger with each passing moment. The eighth and final day of Dr. Kellner's investigation began with the chamber's systems reaching a state of unprecedented activity. The preservation apparatus hummed with energy that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, while the monitoring equipment displayed readings that suggested Princess Dorothea's consciousness had achieved nearly complete awareness of his presence. The atmospheric pressure within the chamber had shifted to levels that made breathing difficult, as if the very air was being transformed by forces beyond scientific understanding. Kellner's attempts to document his final observations were hampered by the increasing intensity of mental intrusions that felt like memories from another lifetime. Images of the castle during its occupied years flooded his consciousness. Elaborate ceremonies, scientific experiments, and the gradual transformation of the Montclair bloodline across generations. The experiences carried emotional weight that suggested he was not merely observing historical events, but reliving them through the accumulated consciousness of those who had participated. The preservation chamber's central apparatus began to emit a low harmonic frequency that resonated through the mountain's bedrock. The sound seemed to awaken something dormant within the castle's structure, as distant chambers echoed with responses that suggested the entire building was designed to function as a massive resonance instrument. The harmonic convergence created vibrations that Kellner felt in his bones, as if his very molecular structure was being tuned to match frequencies established centuries earlier. As the day progressed, Kellner discovered that his prolonged exposure to the chamber's environment had begun to alter his own consciousness in ways that defied rational explanation. He found himself possessing knowledge of Montclair family history that he had never read, understanding scientific principles that would not be discovered for decades, and experiencing emotional connections to individuals who had died before his birth. The genetic resonance described in the preservation protocols was apparently affecting him, despite his lack of direct bloodline connection to the family. The activation controls seemed to beckon with increasing urgency, their biometric scanners responding to his presence in ways that suggested the system recognized him as a suitable candidate for interface with the preserved consciousness. The equipment's responses indicated that Princess Dorothea's awareness had grown strong enough to influence the chamber's operations, directing its systems toward the activation sequence that would restore her to full consciousness. Kellner's final examination of the preservation apparatus revealed that the princess's physical form had undergone transformation during her centuries of suspension. The figure within the central cylinder appeared to have achieved a state between life and death that transcended normal biological classification. Her features displayed the ethereal perfection that had characterized the final generations of the Montclair bloodline, yet they seemed to shift and flow as if her physical form was no longer bound by conventional genetic limitations. The chamber's monitoring systems indicated that the preservation process had reached a critical threshold where continued suspension would no longer be possible. Princess Dorothea's accumulated consciousness had grown beyond the apparatus's capacity to contain it, requiring either activation or permanent dispersal. The choice between awakening a being who possessed centuries of inherited knowledge and allowing the destruction of humanity's most concentrated genetic memory created a dilemma that challenged every principle of scientific ethics. As Kellner approached the activation controls, he experienced a moment of direct communication with the preserved consciousness that transcended normal sensory perception. Princess Dorothea's awareness touched his mind with a presence that felt both ancient and eternal, sharing glimpses of knowledge that spanned centuries of human development. The contact revealed that her preservation had been intended not as an end, but as a beginning, the first step toward a form of genetic immortality that could preserve human consciousness indefinitely. The communication conveyed understanding that the Montclair family's experiments had achieved success beyond their original intentions. Princess Dorothea had become more than a repository of genetic memory. She had evolved into a new form of consciousness that combined individual awareness with collective knowledge inherited from her entire bloodline. Her awakening would mark the emergence of humanity's next evolutionary stage, where genetic memory could be preserved and accessed across generations. In the chamber's final moments of decision, Kellner realized that his discovery of the Montclair estate had not been coincidental. The preservation systems had been designed to attract individuals capable of completing the activation sequence, drawing them through subtle influences that operated across centuries. His academic interest in genealogy had been guided by forces that recognized his potential compatibility with the princess's accumulated consciousness. As darkness fell over the Austrian Alps for the final time during his investigation, Dr. Kellner faced a choice that would determine whether Princess Dorothea's genetic legacy would continue into the modern world or remain forever suspended between life and death in the depths of her ancestral castle. The activation controls awaited his decision, while the chamber's systems pulsed with anticipation of an awakening that had been planned for nearly 2 centuries. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.